Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. I'm sorry, I said it's good to have your conversations. Good to have everyone here tonight. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Tocqueville Lecture Series. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born at the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of the aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or were against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to each other and concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. These free and public lectures, which promote the campus of Jacksonville State, which bring together the campus of Jacksonville State University, other institutions of learning, and the surrounding community together, are sponsored by the Jack Miller Center. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions which continue to animate our national life. We are lucky to come together tonight to be able to listen, think, and reflect with each other, something that bears well with Tocqueville's name, community. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Joseph M. Knippenberg to our campus. He's a professor of politics at Oglethorpe University in Brookhaven, Georgia, where he's taught since 1985. He received his Bachelor of Arts from Michigan State University, Go State Go, and his MA and PhD.
Go green, go white.
Okay. That's it. Basketball and football, right? And his PhD from the University of Toronto. His areas of expertise are 17th and 18th century political philosophy, constitutional law, and liberal education. He is editor with Peter Lawler of Poets, Princes, and Private Citizens, Literary Alternatives to Postmodern Politics. His essays and reviews have appeared in numerous edited volumes and professional journals, as well as on scholarly websites. He currently sits on the board of the Association for Core Texts and Courses, and on the session at Westminster Presbyterian Church. He currently resides in Brookhaven with his wife, Lee, also on the Oglethorpe faculty, and their dog, Lady Bell and cat, Winky. They have 2 adult children, Liam and Charlotte, of whom they are extremely proud of. Plus, I hear he has a few good stories about some of my mentors and friends, but we'll have to invite him back for that lecture next time. Tonight, the Tocqueville Lecture Series welcomes Dr. Knippenberg to present his work, Forgetting or Denying the Good, the True, and the Beautiful, the Precarious Place of Liberal Education in the Contemporary University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Knippenberg.
Thank you. It's very nice of someone who lives. Say nothing else about it. I have my wife, who is at SEC football in all Superior, and I grew up. I agree with that now, and I do own 2 national championships. Michigan State 2000 basketball. And won't mention the other ones. But I'd like to thank the Jack Miller Center for sponsoring this, and Dr. Gross for inviting me to speak. I'm going to start with what I call a semi-autobiographical introduction. There are people in this room who've been around colleges and universities longer than I have, but probably I started as a freshman in January of 1974. I've been teaching at Oglethorpe since 1985. All of my life as a student I spent at what we call research universities. All my life as a teacher I spent at what we call a liberal arts college. Now, some might argue that a liberal education is a luxury, that all we should be doing is honing some specialized or marketable skill. That was my parents' view back in the 70s when I was a student. And it's a view I frequently encounter in the classroom today. I can't tell you how many times students have said to me about a class that A lot of first-generation college students. You know, back in the day, I was a first-generation college student, but have never, in all the years that I've taught, and have asked the question, anyone here not planning on working for a living? Anyone here planning on leading a life of leisure after graduation? No one has said yes. Now, I remind them that the words school and scholar derive from the Greek word schole. But scholars, who are gentlemen or gentlewomen of leisure, are few and far between in 21st century America. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Very few of my students aren't coming to school looking for a credential or a marketable skill. Now, I'll say more about this shortly, but I first want briefly to report about another kind of experience I've had recently. And that is, as I've said, part of what I do in my classes, the classes people want to get out of the way, are teach what some people call great books, classics in political and social thought, authors like Plato, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant. As a student, I was swept off my feet by thinkers like these. As a professor, and the reason I became a professor was to share my enthusiasm with students of my own. Sometimes I succeed, but I increasingly hear this sort of complaint. These authors don't speak to me. I can't see myself in them. They are, wait for it, dead, white males. Now, we'd add some more, we now add not just dead and white, we'd also add heteronormative and cisgender, but you get the point. Now, this trope is nothing new. It's been around since at least the 1980s, when some students at Stanford, now only in Alabama I should say, not Sanford, Stanford, rallied against what Stanford then had as a Western Civ requirement. What's new, I think, is not that some students complain about this for, let's call them, theoretical or ideological reasons, but the pervasiveness and, if you will, popularity of the assertions and arguments that fall under this dead white, etc. Rubric. In its earliest iterations, criticism of the content of general education requirements was largely restricted to elite institutions like Stanford. At almost every non-elite institution, like the one I teach, at which I teach, the challenge to gen ed requirements was more like the one I described earlier. It's, you know, why do I have to do this? I just want to major in business, in exercise science, whatever. And we still encounter that kind of complaint. But it's now joined with another one, purporting to attack the old understanding of liberal education at its root and requiring either a redefinition of liberal education, one which I will ultimately contend is illiberal, or a new defense of liberal education. What I'm going to do in this talk is try to articulate as fully as possible both kinds of challenges and then to point toward a kind of defense. So, in the American context at least, the view of higher education as largely for credentialing and job training has been commonplace for quite some time. I'm going to cite, and I guess it's fortuitous, I'm citing Tocqueville, who in volume 1 draws a contrast between the European and American approaches to education in general and to higher education in particular. And I'm quoting from volume 1 of Tocqueville here. I do not think, he says, that there is a country in the world where, in proportion to population, so few ignorant and fewer learned men are found than in America. Primary education there is within reach of each. Higher instruction is within reach of almost no one. In America, there are few rich. Almost all Americans, therefore, need to practice a profession. Now, every profession requires an apprenticeship. Americans, therefore, can give only the first years of life to the general cultivation of intelligence. At 15, they enter into a career. Thus, their education most often ends in the period when ours begins. If it is pursued beyond this, it is then directed only toward a special and lucrative matter. One studies a science as one takes up a trade, and one takes from it only the applications whose present utility is recognized. And my colleagues in biology always lament this. All their students want to be healthcare professionals. Biology for its own sake. got a daughter who's going to nursing school. I get it. Tocqueville continues, most of the rich in America have begun by being poor. Almost all the idle were in their youth employed. The result is that when one could have the taste for study, one does not have the time to engage in it. And when one has acquired the time to engage in it, one no longer has the taste for it. So he draws a contrast between aristocratic education in Europe and democratic education in America. We Americans direct our education toward a special and lucrative matter. Studying science is one takes up a trade, and taking from it only the applications whose present utility is recognized. Americans study to make a living. Europeans, according to Tocqueville, study for its own sake. This generalization rings as true in 2022 as it did in 1830. I suspect it would also apply to most Europeans now. Now, Tocqueville suggests that there are two preconditions for the pursuit of learning for its own sake. That is to say, the liberal pursuit of learning. You can't seek knowledge for its own sake unless you have wealth and thereby leisure. And the young are much more likely than the old to have the taste for study. For Tocqueville, what this means is that new money, however widely distributed, is unlikely to support liberal learning. People had to earn the money. When they were earning the money, they might have studied. Once they had the money, they're no longer interested in the study. Now, maybe money isn't as necessary as Tocqueville thinks. Socrates, perhaps the greatest liberal learner who ever lived, tells his Athenian judges in the Apology that he is in 10,000-fold poverty because of his pursuits. To the degree that one can have leisure without much money, if, for example, one has relatively modest needs, perhaps wealth isn't so much necessary for liberal learning. Maybe Tocqueville's wrong about that. Two very good recently published books, which I would recommend to you, Zena Hitz's Lost in Thought and Roosevelt Montas's Rescuing Socrates, make such an argument. In other words, perhaps the liberal love of learning can arise almost anywhere, under any circumstances. One has to be young, if only in spirit, and to have leisure. These two conditions are usually associated with biological age and with material wealth, but accidents can happen. Tocqueville concedes as much later in Democracy in America. Now, let me return to my thread. As I've said, our circumstances incline us to view education instrumentally, as a means of achieving personal, largely financial goals. This was the American situation in 1830, and I'll argue now that in some respects it was our situation long before that. In an earlier version of this paper, when I was just going kind of crazy, I offered multiple examples. I'm going to restrict myself here for your benefit to one. And that is a letter that John Adams wrote in May of 1780 to Abigail. He was in Paris. Abigail was back in the United States. He says to Abigail, since my arrival this time, I have driven about Paris more than I did before. The rural scenes around this town are charming. The public walks, gardens, etc., are extremely beautiful. The gardens of the Palais Royal, the gardens of the Tuileries are very fine. The Place de Louis XV, the Place Vendôme or Place de Louis XIV, the Place Victoire, the Place Royal are fine squares ornamented with very magnificent statues. I wish I had time to describe these objects to you in a manner that I should have done 25 years ago. To take a walk in the gardens of the Palace of the Tuileries, to describe the statues there, all in marble, in which the ancient divinities and heroes are represented with exquisite art, would be a most pleasant amusement and instructive entertainment, improving in history, biology, poetry, as well as in statuary. Another walk in the gardens of Versailles would be useful and agreeable. But to observe these objects with taste and to describe them so as to be understood would require more time and thought than I can possibly spare. It is not indeed the fine arts which our country requires. The useful, the mechanic arts are those which we have occasion for in a young country. I don't have time for all this beauty. Now, note that Adams possesses the capacity to describe and understand what he is observing. He graduated from Harvard College 25 years ago. That 25-year reference in there is not an accident. And received at Harvard a classical liberal education. But that capacity produced by that education is not now what our country requires. In 1780, the young country requires the useful, the mechanic arts. He says later in the letter, The science of government it is my duty to study, more than all the other sciences. The art of legislation and administration and negotiation ought to take place, indeed to exclude in a manner all other arts. I must study politics and war that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture, in order to give their students a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. Adams' appreciation of this moment in American history leads him to begin with politics and war. While Aristotle might regard politics and philosophy as the appropriate subjects for leisured liberal consideration, Adams regards them as instrumental and ministerial. His liberal education, which enables him to appreciate the moment, leads him to regard something as higher than politics, painting, poetry, music, etc., for which he does not currently have time. Politics and war are required to secure liberty, which then enables the study of the useful arts, among them commerce and agriculture. But those useful arts are also instrumental and ministerial, generating the wealth and leisure necessary to contemplate the beautiful. Now, I think it's important to consider the words that Adams uses in this passage. He says, I must, he says, have liberty, ought, and give their children a right. Adams' successful fulfillment of his duty gives his sons liberty, which they're obliged to use in a particular way so that the next generation has a right to contemplate beauty. There are three moments here. Let me call them the political, the commercial, and the commercial and agricultural, and the aesthetic. The first, the political moment, is marked by necessity. The second, the commercial and agricultural moment, is marked by liberty. And the third, the aesthetic moment, is marked by leisure. Neither necessity nor liberty precludes duty and responsibility. Necessity doesn't merely excuse, and liberty doesn't merely permit. I'm tempted to say that the duty associated with politics is the promotion of liberty, and the duty associated with commerce is the facilitation of leisure. Commerce isn't about money making for its own sake, however tempting that prospect is. And politics isn't about the pursuit and accumulation of power, either for its own sake or for the sake of accumulating wealth. But the appropriate contemplation of the beautiful, the end of it all, is a matter neither of duty nor of compulsion. Now, I promised that this very brief consideration of Adams would advance and complicate my argument. The liberally educated Adam acknowledges economic necessity, but places it after political responsibility and in service of a meaningful life of leisurely contemplation of the beautiful. The fuller, more complicated view that comes from Adams is that we can't neglect our material needs and the responsibilities associated with them, but also that a full and fully human life is about more than this. His education opened this world up to him. Should we, his descendants, abandon it for the merely instrumental good of wealth? Should we cut off all the complexity and beauty that Adams thought of as he lived up to his rather onerous duty, as he thought it? Now, these considerations come again in a debate that occurred in the last part of the 19th and into the early part of the 20th century. That's the debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois about what kind of education to offer blacks who had hitherto known nothing but slavery and sharecropping. The contrasting models were embodied in the Hampton and Tuskegee Institutes on the one side and Atlanta University on the other. Now, Washington is famous as a proponent of the sort of industrial education he received at Hampton and propagated at Tuskegee. He uses the term liberal education, so far as I can tell, only once in Up From Slavery, where he says that daily contact with Samuel Chapman Armstrong, Hampton's founder, alone would have been a liberal education. He continues, the older I grow, the more convinced I am that there is no education which one can get from books and costly apparatus that is equal to that which can be gotten from contact with great men and women. Instead of studying books so constantly, how I wish our schools and colleges might learn to study men and things. Now, this preference for what we would now call experiential learning seems to be closely connected with two other positions. One is that, according to Washington's account of black attitudes in the South, the study of Greek and Latin, still the hallmark of a liberal education in his time, and indeed this sort of education altogether, seem to be associated with freedom from, and indeed a positive disdain for work, especially manual labor. Given the current circumstances of Southern blacks, Washington believes, this opinion is counterproductive. What one could gain from the study of men and things is an appreciation of the virtues and habits that produce success and engender self-respect in the respect of others. And from the study of things, the skills that combined with those virtues and habits make one useful and respected in one's community. He says, in our industrial teaching, we keep three things in mind. First, the student shall be so educated that he shall be enabled to meet conditions as they exist now. In a word, to be able to do the thing which the world wants done. Second, that every student who graduates from the school shall have enough skill, coupled with intelligence and moral character, to enable him to make a living for himself and others. Third, to send every graduate out feeling and knowing that labor is dignified and beautiful, to make each one love labor instead of trying to escape it. Now, let me restate Washington's view in somewhat different terms. The classical aristocratic and pagan stance toward work is that it is ultimately slavish and hence unbefitting a free human being. The ancients were all about leisure. Now, the Christian stance is a little more complicated. Earning one's bread by the sweat of one's brow is the punishment for original sin. But we also are called to work. To be human is to work so as to glorify God. We rest, that is to say, have leisure, so to speak, only on the Sabbath when we're glorifying God in a different way. For blacks in the postbellum South, the degrading character of work under slavery makes the pagan view very tempting. But from Washington's perspective, both as a religious matter and as a practical, which is to say economic, political, and sociological matter, this view is literally counterproductive. To the degree that it prepares for a life of leisure, a classical liberal education suits Southern blacks, and for that matter, Southern whites, or for that matter, most Americans, for a world that does not exist. Whether that world be considered from a Christian or secular perspective, duty, charity, self-assertion, and self-interest all produce for Washington the same result. Now, Du Bois reviewed Up from Slavery. It became chapter 3 of The Souls of Black Folk, that review. For his part, Du Bois affirms that it is proper, as he says, to advocate with Mr. Washington a broad system of black common schools, supplemented by thorough industrial training. But he is surprised that a man of Mr. Washington's insight can see that no such educational systems ever rested or can rest on any other basis than that of the well-equipped college and university. And he insists that there's a demand for a few such institutions throughout the South to train the best of the black youth as teachers, professional men, and leaders. Now, this response meets Washington on his chosen ground, but Du Bois goes much further. Both in The Souls of Black Folk and in another essay published in 1903 called The Talented Tenth, which I would recommend to you. I'm going to quote at length from Talented Tenth now. If we make money the object of man training, we shall develop money makers, but not necessarily men, says Du Bois. If we make technical skill the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not in nature men. Men we shall have only as we make manhood the object of the work of the school. Intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world as it was and is, and the relation of men to it. This is the curriculum of that higher education which must underlie true life. On this foundation, we may build bread-winning skill of hand and quickness of brain, with never a fear lest the child and man mistake the means of living for the object of life. A university, he continues, is a human invention for the transmission of knowledge and culture from generation to generation, through the training of quick minds and pure hearts. And for this work, no other human invention will suffice, not even trade and industrial schools. Every isolated group or nation must have its yeast, must have for the talented few centers of training where men are not so mystified and befuddled by the hard and necessary toil of earning a living as to have no aims higher than their bellies and no God greater than gold. If we start out to train an ignorant and unskilled people with a heritage of bad habits, our system of training must set before its two great aims. The one dealing with knowledge and character, the other seeking to give the child the technical knowledge necessary for him to earn a living under the present circumstances. I could go on longer, but I just want to quote the last sentence in this passage. It is the trained living human soul, cultivated and strengthened by long study and thought, that breathes the real breath of life into boys and girls and makes them human, whether they be black or white, Greek, Russian, or American. Two things stand out from this passage. There is Du Bois's distinction between the means of living, that's to say work, and the object of life. To be human is not merely to have work or to be a worker. The second point is that the task of cultivating humanity is a task for everyone, whether they be black or white, Greek, Russian, or American. Du Bois's argument is not just one made by a black man for a black audience. Every people in every setting requires an education that cultivates intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and the relation of men to it. That education may, of course, be adjusted to the time, places, and circumstances of the people who need to use it, but it is not mere training for today's or even tomorrow's workplace. Higher education, if we think through the examples I've given here, that is to say, Tocqueville, Adams, and Du Bois in Washington, can be, and certainly in a democratic context, must be preparation for work, but also something else. We have, I fear, all too frequently lost sight of that something else. And where we haven't, what bids fair to define it offers, for the most part, a different form of illiberality. To that issue I now turn. Virtually every day, new section, I spend some time perusing articles from the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is one of our major trade publications. In the weeks since I began thinking about this paper, I came across a couple of items that bear on my topic. An article in mid-March reported on a controversy regarding a proposed new mission statement for the University of Massachusetts at Boston. Think of that as the Massachusetts equivalent of UAB or Georgia State. Here's part of the proposed mission statement. As an academic community of global and local citizens, we are committed to becoming an anti-racist and health-promoting institution that honors and uplifts the cultural wealth of our students. We support various and diverse forms of knowledge production that enrich the lives of all communities, especially those historically undervalued and underserved. We are a public urban university dedicated to teaching, learning, and research rooted in equity, environmental sustainability, social and racial justice, innovation, and expansive notions of excellence. Now, some faculty responded to this by issuing an open letter. Here's what the faculty said. We believe these statements trample on the fundamental role of the university to facilitate the creation, curation, and dissemination of knowledge. To elaborate, we believe that the main goals of the university are to empower the pursuit of knowledge, to cultivate lifelong learning, to foster the exchange of ideas, to encourage critical thinking, to unequivocally support free inquiry, and to instill a respect for the diversity of ideas and viewpoints. Under no circumstances can political activism be the primary purpose of a public university. This is not to say students, faculty, and staff cannot be activists. Quite the contrary. Individual people are the agents of social change, and as such, they should be encouraged to organize and fight for a better society. It's not the role, they insist, of the university to coerce students, faculty, or institutional units to take action, but rather to empower people to take action for themselves. They say there's a stark difference between an institution devoted to teaching, learning, and research rooted in equity, social and racial justice, and one whose main goals are to empower the pursuit of knowledge, to cultivate lifelong learning, and so on. The former has explicitly answered the question of justice, while the latter presents itself as the venue in which different compelling answers to the question of justice are explored or debated. The former is institutionally activist on behalf of a known and predetermined agenda. The latter offers to inform those who are activists on their own behalf and on behalf of others in a variety of causes. Now, the article also reported some comments by students, and a couple caught my attention. One student said, in academia, there is this notion that we are objective researchers, that we aren't activists, that we are trying to be objective and produce new knowledge. But that is reasoning that is very steeped in whiteness. People of color always need to justify their point of view as being objective, but white people never need to do that. This notion that we need to maintain this idea of objectivity so that we don't contaminate our research, that's how racism hides itself. That's how racism becomes invisible. Another student said she was shocked by the letter of opposition and made her look at her professors differently. The fact that they think politics and research can be kept separate is disturbing and, this is the phrase that really caught my attention, even hurtful. Now, these positions are accommodated by the draft mission statement, Note that the thrust underlying them owes a lot in the first instance to the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and his postmodern progeny, read through the somewhat distorting lenses of neo-Marxism and anti-racism, which is a form of neo-Marxism. The notion that scholarship can be separated from politics, from the will to power, is ultimately racist and hence disturbing and even hurtful. No one is looking for the truth. Rather, everyone is pursuing an interest. Everyone is, in the binary popularized by Ibram X. Kendi, either racist or anti-racist. To disagree with this proposition, even if one regards it as a plausible contender in the academic marketplace of ideas, is also to hurt or to disturb or hurt students. In terms of the proposed mission statement, it seems to me anti-racist and health promoting are virtual synonyms. Now that got my juices flowing one morning. Another morning, I noticed an interview with David Bromwich, a distinguished literary critic and professor of English at Yale. Here's what Bromwich had to say. But now he says there's a different idea of the distinguishing trait of the university. It should be socially improving, interested in creating a good society or a model of a good society. We've got to be like society, only better. But if universities are places of learning and research, they can contribute to social improvement, but it can't be their preoccupation. We're seeing a defection from the earlier idea of the university as a separate kind of institution, an absorption of new responsibilities, which the people in charge of universities are hardly conscious of now because it's going into its second generation. We have a whole layer of therapeutic administrators concerned with things like student life, speech habits, how we should talk to each other. Talk about the increase in numbers of administrators doesn't often pick out that group of people who are there to tell the students what kind of community they're in, to tell them who they are. Here, Bromwich observes the same phenomenon that characterized the disagreement over the proposed mission statement. The university is still in some sense about learning and research, but that activity, once thought to be the central and defining aspect of the university, has become ministerial to the university's role as the model and progenitor of a good society. A certain kind of activism and a certain kind of scholarship that supports it define the university. Make two comments here. First, I have no doubt that university is a particular kind of community with particular ends. I might even be tempted to contend with Socrates that knowledge is the only truly common good, and hence that the community of those who pursue knowledge is the only true community. But it is not and cannot be the model of a comprehensive political community. Communities of scholars can't, shouldn't, don't have defense policies, don't have economic policies. State is about things like facilitating and improving the marketplace and defending a community. Universities aren't about those things. Second, given the ministerial role of the professoriate, whose scholarship and teaching are in service of a vision of the good society, it is no accident that a leading role in defining the mission of the university, and hence its agenda, falls to people other than professors. These days, the principal contenders for this role are donors and trustees who represent the marketplace, and the administrators who superintend the anti-racist and health promoting community on the other side. Bromwich has more to say, and I do commend the interview to you, but I'm going to skip the other part I was going to quote because in the interest of time. Now, let me flag the issues that seem to me to arise from these anecdotes. I spoke previously about the instrumentalization of education on behalf of what Du Bois characterized as the commercial spirit of the age, both in his time and ours. It goes without saying that when students enter the university or college, they have their own aims that they want their education to serve. A successful educational community should transform those aims, should enlarge those aims, inducting students into a new kind of community with new norms. Education should be transformative. Stated starkly, a liberal education would take someone who was in some respects unfree, prepare him or her to be a free human being. Certainly that was Du Bois's view. Free human beings can disagree about much. They can give or withhold their allegiance to particular social and political communities or agendas. What characterizes them above all is that their allegiance to these communities or agendas is thoughtful or self-critical. I'm going to use this as a dirty word now, but it really isn't. Liberal education is not simply civic education. Aristotle says in the Politics, The excellent human being, the excellent citizen are not the same. What many of the attempts to subordinate scholarship, teaching, and learning to politics, or to identify them with politics, do, is turn education or liberal education into a kind of civic education. I've spent a lot of time talking about the representatives of the marketplace, which, in some senses, all of us have to work. Let me turn to the attempts at a kind of distorted or proposed civic education or political education. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time here talking about, I guess, what is a hot button issue now, critical race theory. I'm on sabbatical this semester, and one of the things that I've permitted myself to do is to do a lot of reading. And in addition to reading for this paper, I read a lot of critical race theory and critiques of critical race theory. I know a little bit about it. I know that one of the great founders of, recognized as one of the founders of critical race theory is Kimberly Crenshaw. Now, she tells us that CRT grew out of another acronym, CLS, Critical Legal Studies, which is a Marxist argument that law embodies the interests of the ruling class. Any of you who have read Plato's Republic will see that, that's an argument that goes back much further than Marx. Already in the 1970s and 1980s, when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, neo-Marxism was moving beyond simple class analysis to examine race and gender, as well as class. If Marx and Engels would have reduced an argument to the class interests of those who make it, there is no philosophical pursuit of wisdom, only the expression of class interests. That's what ideology means. Proponents of CRT would reduce the argument to the racial interests of those who make it. For CRT, classical liberalism and capitalism are not simply ideologies of a particular ruling class defined economically. They are also, and perhaps more importantly, the ideologies of a particular ruling class defined racially. On this view, liberalism and capitalism express, protect, and justify whiteness or white supremacy. Now, we can apply this analysis to the contemporary university. Certainly, Crenshaw and her colleagues are very happy to do so. Contemporary university is largely, they think, a product of Enlightenment thinking, which is essentially white thinking, normalizing and expressing the interests of whites over against people of color, over whom they attempted to exercise their imperium. I read recently a collection of essays that Crenshaw and some of her colleagues edited, and the two passages come from that collection. Every established discipline in the academy has an origin that entails engagement and complicity with white supremacy. During their emergence and initial development, most academic disciplines had no difficulty, quote unquote, seeing race. The logic of racial hierarchy and colonialism structured the very foundations of their research and teaching paradigms. Their development was coextensive with the emergence of imperialism, slavery, and modern racism. This is where we get talk about decolonizing the disciplines, and they're with the university. So my colleagues talk about decolonizing a lot. Now, there are two ways in which this decolonization can be understood. On the one hand, if we take seriously the claim that every system of ideas, i.e. every discipline and every quote-unquote philosophy, is at bottom an ideology that is an expression or justification for, say, one's race or class interests, then persuasion is ultimately impossible. One's interests are one's interests. Those whose interests are expressed or embodied in a discipline, or for that matter in a university, cannot be persuaded to abandon them. They can only be defeated and replaced. There is no truth which all can share, but only interests locked in a so-called zero-sum conflict. We are perhaps fortunate only to catch glimpses of what this conflict looks like when, on the one side, speakers are deplatformed, or professors and others are intimidated into silence, or on the other side, where external political authorities used to forbid, for example, the teaching of CRT. It could be worse. Think of all the Jewish scholars who managed, they were the lucky ones, got out of Nazi Germany. All of these phenomena are, I contend, almost inevitable consequences of the view that words only express interests, that they do not aspire to state truths, which we're all seeking and in which we all can, in principle, share. All education on this view is indoctrination, a certain kind of distorted civic education, if you will. Alternatively, we can say that people are open to persuasion, that reason and evidence can lead them to change their understandings. that words and ideas are or can be genuine attempts to grasp the truth, that knowledge transcending the racial, class-based, or gender particularity of those who seek it is possible. That is the premise, I think, underlying philosophy as Socrates presents it, as well as the premise underlying liberal education. W.E.B. Du Bois expresses it eloquently in The Souls of Black Folk. This is probably, for some people, the most famous passage from Souls of Black Folk. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension. So, wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. In an earlier passage, the same work, he describes the education as he experienced it as a teacher at Atlanta University. In a half dozen classrooms, he says, they gather then, here to follow the love song of Dido, here to listen to the tale of Troy divine, there to wander among the stars, there to wander among men and nations, and elsewhere other well-worn ways of knowing this queer world. Nothing new, no time-saving devices, simply old-time glorified methods of delving for truth and searching out the hidden beauties of life and learning the good of living, the good, the true, and the beautiful. The riddle of existence is the college curriculum that was laid before the pharaohs, that was taught in the groves by Plato, that formed the trivium and quadrivium, and is today laid before the freedmen's sons by Atlanta University. And this course of study will not change. Its methods will grow more deft and effectual, its content richer by toil of scholar and sight of seer. But the true college will ever have one goal, not to earn meat, but to know the end and aim of that life which meat nourishes. Knowing the end and aim of that life which meat nourishes is an ageless quest, one that does not depend upon the race, class, or gender identity of the person who enters into it. It is neither white nor colorblind in the way deprecated by the contributors to Crenshaw's edited volume. It seeks truth wherever and among whomever it may be found. It takes people from where they are and brings them beyond the color line. This second version of decolonization broadens the canon, introducing everyone who seeks to learn to additional sources of insight and truth, sources that may have hitherto been overlooked. Establishing the curriculum is not a matter of exercising one's power on behalf of one's interest or one's constituency, but rather finding ways to satisfy one's longing to know and to grasp the good, the true, and the beautiful. I wish I could say that the second sort of decolonization is more prominent than the first, but I fear that it is not. Now it's time for me to draw the threads of my argument together and see where I am in terms of time. Promise no more than 5 more minutes. I've contended that in our time, liberal education faces 2 serious challenges. The first one is almost as old as the American Republic. Virtually since the founding of the country, influential figures have been questioning the appropriateness of traditional liberal education for our circumstances. Many of the reforms suggested have retained something of the old education, adding to it a more practical component that prepares students for the world of work and for citizenship in a democratic republic. In a sense, the typical combination of the general education program with a major offers a template for how these 2 orientations, the liberal and the professional or vocational, can be combined. So long as those overseeing the enterprise retain a respect for the purposes of liberal education, a thoughtful and leisurely, at least for the moment, of the end and aim of that life which meat nourishes, perhaps this combination of reconciliation can be sustained. That was the case, I think, through the first half of the 20th century. I'm much less confident than it is so now, and there are a lot of reasons for this. I could spend a lot of time talking about the reasons for this. If you want to see something of it, I recommend to you a cranky book written by the sociologist Robert Nisbet in 1971 called The Degradation of Academic Dogma. Suffice it to say that almost no one in our major research universities really cares about liberal education. Certainly the football coaches don't. The Regents professors. I have a friend who's a Regents professor. And I remember making small talk with him one time. He's literally a rocket scientist at Georgia. I said, it was the fall. I was starting to, how are the students? He looked at me kind of funny. Students? You don't care about students. my daughter-in-law is starting a PhD program at the University of Georgia, and her PI, principal investigator, doesn't really care. Cares about the research. And, you know, she's a graduate of a liberal arts college, and I think has and I'm there bashing her over the head with liberal education, so she's probably somewhat better off. But, you know, at those R1 schools, Georgia, Alabama, Georgia State, UAB, they don't care about this. They don't care about it. They don't care about liberal education. Now, that indifference has left a vacuum that some people are very happy to fill. And what's filling it nowadays is, in large measure, for a variety of reasons, some good and some bad, a concern with students' identities. And some of this is what I call subjectivist, and others reductivist. Subjectivist in the sense that each of us has his or her own truth, or their own truth. You know, my students have kind of the simplest version of that. There's, you know, I ask questions to which, in their view, it's not even that there are better and worse answers. Every answer is right. Every answer is good because it's their truth. Now, the reductivist argument is that basically truths are dependent upon certain demographic features that we're all very familiar with. I'm not going to go much into that. Following these conceptions, we can only address groups on behalf of themselves in terms that are ultimately only comprehensible to or valid to those who belong to the group. There is or should be no common curriculum. Now, we have in the United States, in the last century especially, accommodated this. We have, you know, you all get electives, right? You can tailor to some degree your own undergraduate programs. And we even carry that over into some general education programs where there are so-called cafeteria style programs. You know, you get to pick how your general education is requirements are completed. But behind the latter view is at least the following rather trite and vacuous statement. We want students to be well-rounded. Now, I don't think that's adequate, but at least it's a vision of common humanity. And well-rounded doesn't mean the freshman 10. Doesn't mean this. It still retains something, if only a vestige of a sense that a college is a community of people engaged in an undertaking. Now, I am not about to jump on the, you know, the very common and not very smart state bandwagon. Let's ban the teaching of whatever we don't like. I think we should teach those identitarian theories alongside others as alternative understandings worth taking seriously, and hence worth challenging or disputing. But when they are taken as the foundational framework, they forestall the serious consideration of those other alternatives by relativizing or discrediting them in advance. If, for example, the history of philosophy is simply a series of expressions of white supremacy or collection of ruling class ideologies, why should we study it? Why should we take any author, from Plato to John Stuart Mill to Friedrich Nietzsche to Martin Heidegger, as anything other than an apologist for a distasteful and reprehensible position, or is merely expressing, this is the neutral way of putting, a self that's different from and hence irrelevant to our own selves? If learning involves, at least in part, encountering views that are different from the one in which one was raised, these theories, which discredit in advance, inoculate us against having to take these other views seriously, against gaining anything from them, learning anything from them. We're permitted to feel indifferent or even superior to positions taken and arguments made by those proverbial, okay, dead white, heteronormative, cisgender males. The combination of these two tendencies, the focus on the practical and professional on the one hand, and the denial that the tradition of thought, literature, and culture has anything to say to us, attacks the root of liberal education. Now, I think there are three paths going forward. One is no more liberal education. Job training, consciousness raising. And consciousness raising is only for the people who want the fluff, who can afford the luxury of a full residential college experience. The second is higher education is politically contested terrain, with different identity groups battling for control of particular pieces of turf. You have the tug of war between folks on campus and folks off campus, between the state legislatures on the one side and the people who are, defending the, well, I mean, they want to say they're defending the autonomy of the university, but they're defending is the turf they take. That's just power politics. That's not, and it's a possible future. It's already here. Now, the third possibility encompasses both of those that I've already mentioned, while adding one more. At the margins of vocationalism and political condensation, a vision of genuine liberal education can survive, finding homes and patrons where it can. Socrates survived into old age amid the sophistry and political turmoil of Athens. Why can't liberal education persist in a more diverse and pluralistic environment, so long as it continues to find patrons as well as teachers and students? We have that here. We have the patron, Jack Miller Center, thank you very much. We have the teacher, Gross, and some other folks in the audience, and we have the students. It lives in a small way. And I'm not saying in unpromising terrain. I'm not saying anything bad about Jacksonville State University in saying that. Every college and university in this country is unpromising terrain, but it lives. And it's the survival of this prospect to which this talk, this essay, this, it's kind of, I turned 65 this year. This is, I can say these things because I'm not going to be around forever. And I have tenure and sorry. And if they take away my tenure, I'll say, thank you. I can retire. Well, but, and I have to retire with the comfort that liberal education doesn't require major resources. Thank you very much. Happy to entertain any questions. Yes, sir.
You said that the liberal education is about the study of the beautiful, and it's. So do you think that in an effort to try to return the proper definition of liberal education in America, we should move to what some government officials are proposing in trying to greatly reduce or even completely eliminate tuition costs at public universities?
As a matter of policy, I think it's a bad idea. I think we have a market that has generated immense amounts of wealth, and it produces a great profusion of different kinds of institutions and different programs. It makes wealthy people like Jack Miller who want to support genuine liberal education. I think ultimately, and I have very little sympathy with all the state legislators who want to banish CRT. Paying for it. If you let the government, and making something free means, well, in the first instance, the government is paying for it. In the second instance, well, as I always tell my students, I'm not paying for this. I'm getting more government than I'm paying for, right? And we in the foreseeable future will get more government. Someone's going to pay for it. So, thank you, my great-grandchildren. But the problem with that is we got to have great-grandchildren before. My late friend, dear friend Peter Lawler, used to have this, made a joke about how you could save Social Security. He said, he recommended this to students. It was, only partly in jest. And he said, two things to them: have lots of children and start smoking. But the bottom line is, if the government is paying for it, the government is going to tell us what kind of education we're going to offer. And I'd rather have a plethora of different kinds of sources of support for higher education. And, when I was younger, I had more contempt for the marketplace than I have now. I don't think that the world is only about making money. I'm extremely happy that a lot of people have been very successful at making money and also understand that the world is not only about making money. And they are willing to give generously, support a variety of different enterprises in higher education. The good, the true, and the beautiful. Now, I know it doesn't, some of it doesn't, I come relatively cheaply, and the kind of education I do comes relatively cheap. And there are kinds of research that are extremely expensive. My rocket scientist friend, his research is expensive. I have a dear colleague who, in another life, was a high energy physicist. His research comes really expensive, which is why he doesn't do it. He thinks about cosmology. But I'm happy that there's, great plurality and diversity in the United States. I'm happy there are public and private institutions. I received my graduate education in Canada, where there are no, I think there's maybe one private university. Everything else is provincially supported. The great disruptive innovation in Europe and elsewhere in the world is the creation of private universities. I had the great privilege of visiting one of them in one of the most unpromising places for anything like liberal education. I was in Iraq, in the Kurdish Autonomous Region. There's an American liberal arts college called American University of Iraq Suleimani. And it's a remarkable place. It is extremely countercultural because Iraqi universities are typically Middle Eastern universities. It's all about high stakes examinations and everyone wants a professional education. What are the big degrees? You want to be either a doctor or a petroleum engineer. Those are the two things that they almost study. And AUIS had people studying history and studying philosophy. Now, countercultural. I don't know how long it can survive in a culture that is not hospitable to it. But it was going great for a while. And the Iraqi system is much more typical. Our system here owes a great deal to the British system. And that grew up under the aegis of the church. But it became public based. But there's still a kind of respect for it. And we're, as I said, very fortunate that there's a huge diversity of different kinds of institutions in the United States. And the kind of education that I favor is not terribly expensive. It doesn't need all sorts of fancy research. Yes.
I was just wondering, how do you clarify the dynamic between capitalism and liberal education, as capitalism at its root prioritizes money and market over the study of beautiful things? How do you kind of?
Well, as I said, there are capitalists who realize that money isn't everything, and they give a lot of it away. I do think that there's, and I once, when I teach Adam Smith, I teach good chunks of The Wealth of Nations, and Smith actually talks about, he says some very interesting things. And how many of you have read any of The Wealth of Nations? Most famous chapter, first chapter is on division of labor, right? And one of the things he talks about, why is division of labor so powerfully productive? One of the reasons is specialization, right? Which is antithetical to liberal education. Another thing that makes a division of labor so powerful, machines. And how are machines invented? You want to remember that passage? Who invents the machine? There are two sources of machine invention. One is the people who are sick of doing the same thing over and over again, so they invent a machine that enables them not to have to do it anymore. Then he also says the other inventors of machines are people who are put in a position to notice different and dissimilar things. People who do nothing but observe everything. Those are the liberally educated. Now, I don't want to push that line of argument too hard in a practical sense, but Smith's argument ultimately is that capitalism can't be productive unless you have people who are able to notice different and dissimilar things, who have the leisure not to do one thing, not to be hyper-specialized, most of us are, but to sit back and observe everything. So I would, say to almost any capitalist, you need me. Smith also distinguishes between productive and unproductive labor. I am an unproductive laborer. Proudly. You need me. I saw another hand. In the back there.
Adam Smith also wrote another book,
Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Theory of Moral Assessment, and in that, he was very much not necessarily against capitalism, but what we should be doing isn't about money, right? And so he's very critical of this capitalistic kind of notion that and of course everyone knows the Wealth of Nations, nobody knows moral sentiments.
I teach both. And, scholars notice this. There's the whole body of literature called the Adams on the so-called Adam Smith problem. How to fit those two books together. I think Smith would say that, first of all, even in the Wealth of Nations, he says things like he makes moral observations, but he also says, it's not from the generosity of the butcher, the baker, the brewer that I will get my meal. I get my meal by appealing to their interests, not to their benevolence. He does think that benevolence matters, but it matters in some measure at the margins. Now, here's an example of a kind of Smithian example. I can't locate it in Smith, but why does Dr. Gross work so hard?
Not tenure.
Personal.
Well, he has a family he cares about. What gets him busy, what gives him an incentive to work, is the fact that there's a group of people he really cares for more than he cares for everyone. If we had to rely on everyone's sort of universal benevolence, we'd be in trouble. What we rely on is people's very focused attention to and attraction to and affection for a small group of people for whom they feel responsible. So, yeah, if we were all just solitary monads, individuals who cared only for ourselves, I know what I was like when I was single. Professors will appreciate this. When I was single, I never taught summer school once. I'm married, now adult children, but I've been teaching summer school ever since we had kids. I work harder because there are these people I love. And so I don't think that benevolence is anti-capitalist. I think it's the energy that makes capitalism work well, and you hope it softens people. It gives them an incentive to work hard, but also gives them something to care about other than the money. We're not just about the money. And Smith, even in the Wealth of Nations, he isn't just about the money. Yes.
Judging from parts of your talk and from the degradation of academic dogma, the university itself has placed itself in this position by, for instance, kind of making something like the classics, which is foundational in a liberal education, synonymous with the elite. But now universities are attempting to mitigate that fact, by doing community outreach programs, trying to get people from underrepresented groups into the university. Do you think that initiatives like that could turn around the trajectory that universities are on, or is it too late?
Okay, I said at the beginning, I'm a first-generation college student. My parents are both immigrants, Now, they both immigrated from Western Europe after World War II. Neither of them had a college education. So their view of college, I remember getting my job at Oglethorpe and my mom saying, now that you have your job, you're going to go to law school? You're going to make some real money? No, that's what I'm doing. But in terms of, I teach a lot of now first generation sons and daughters of immigrants. In my case, I mean, Oglethorpe is now, has become in recent years a majority minority institution. So I have a lot of Latino students, and I have a lot of South Asian immigrant students, and I have a lot of Black students, some of whom are, have long histories in the Southeast, others either from the islands or more recently, either parents or grandparents from Africa. And fun to teach. They're certainly more fun to teach than a lazy kid who, what's the term we used to use, hasn't checked his or her privilege. And I'm not saying, all good on one side, all bad on the other. I think there's a lot of frustrating things. A lot of frustrating things across the board. But I do think that, if people believe something and care about something, there's a way in which, I think I can get to them. Sometimes they, kind of crawl into a defensive posture and on various anonymous social media sites, I've been called every name in the book by students. And it scares me when that happens because it does threaten my livelihood. But it also means I'm pushing a button. I'm getting a reaction. And it's an anti-intellectual reaction. And I need to push I wish they'd say it to my face. Can I work with it? But it means that I'm saying something that matters. And that's what I want to do. I don't, okay, I care in some ways where they end up. I'm not going to be proud of the student who was a mass murderer, but they don't have to agree with me, but they have to think. And if I can make them think, then I've, accomplished my goal. I used to say, my measure of success in a class was that I persuaded you that the book I assigned was actually worth holding on to. That you didn't just, well, it used to be, students bought them and then sold them. Now they just rent them. Well, I want you to rent it and then decide you really want to own it. If I do that, then, and I have had, I've had former students who've told me that. That book is still sitting on my shelf. Yay. Now, you may not have looked at it, but it meant something to you, and it still means something. Yes, sir.
In a society that is so inhospitable to the people that like liberal arts and leisure and want to learn scholarly things, in a society that's so inhospitable to that, what do you say to people that want to make that type of thing and say to be a professor?
Well, I used to be proud of students who went on to be professors. And a lot of us measure our worth in the fact that, this student of mine is a teacher, a professor, or so on, himself or herself. There are so few jobs now. So my first move is always going to be to try really hard to talk you out of it. If I fail to talk you out of it, then you go in with your eyes open. what I think is also possible, and this is in some ways more realistic. You can continue to learn, you can continue to read, you can continue to think without being a professor. You can just don't watch as much TV. Or, you know, watch TV that, and, you know, there was you noted this too, Paul Cantor. He's a world-class Shakespeare scholar at the University of Virginia. And I knew him sort of well. He watched a lot of TV and he wrote about it. And he wrote about it really intelligently and interestingly. And I once heard him give a talk where he basically said that, you know, with streaming services, the long form television series or miniseries is the contemporary equivalent of any great drama that you would have found in the past. That the great artists today are working in that long form television. You know, when I was younger, we thought of TV as a crass commercial medium, and it's, you know, art film. You know, especially if it has subtitles. That was where the real, artistic genius is. I think you can do a whole lot more with, a series that lasts for several seasons and over multiple. You can develop a much more complicated and subtle story. Now, not all of it is, and I watched some trash. But my son, convinced me of this. One show that really repays multiple rewatchings is Westworld. Another one that I think also is, thoughtful and interesting is Deadwood. So, I mean, I'm not saying I read and I watch TV. And I usually have at least one sort of work-related book and one novel going on. As an antidote, I just finished reading a Balzac novel, and so my antidote to the darkness of Balzac is a different kind of darkness, but it's Evil Noir. I recommend. When COVID first hit and we were all shut down, my therapy was reading Trollope. And I recommend Trollope to anyone who wants to enter into a 19th century English universe. The Palliser novels are the best education about society and parliamentary politics in 19th century England that you could find. So, just read a lot. Anyone can read. Anyone, who's been introduced to how to read by a liberal education and continue that liberal education in his or her leisure. And one of the best recent testimonies to that I've come across is a book I mentioned in my remarks, Zena Hitz's Lost in Thought. She teaches at St. John's College in Annapolis, so she's a professional, so to speak. But she writes very movingly and very powerfully about people who are not professors, who gain an awful lot from their encounters with, you have to be great books, good books. By the way, I'm not sure that Bridgerton qualifies. My wife we just finished season 2. My wife and daughter is all over it. I was kind of looking at it and looking at my phone. Any other questions?
We have a couple questions from online.
Okay.
Let me get Benjamin up here. His mic and his camera should be allowed now. Benjamin, if you could hear us.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Okay, sweet. Can y'all hear me?
Wonderful.
All right. So my question is, let me see. Hopefully there's not too much feedback here. My question is, well, I gotta give a little bit of background first. So I teach middle school. I teach in a pretty low income area, and I come across a lot of students who unfortunately are still on sometimes second and third grade reading levels in the 7th grade. And because of our messed up public education system, they're kind of just being passed up, you know. And there are a lot of these students that I know are going to graduate high school probably with, you know, with barely even with the ability to read because of grade inflation and things like that. And so sometimes, you know, I'm someone who, you know, very deeply values like the liberal education, but as someone who has known, you know, friends of mine who have gone to college without a very, you know, distinct plan and without the work ethic and drive to really take it seriously. I know a lot of people who go to college and then end up either dropping out or in a lot of debt or, you know, just kind of lost. And so my question is, does it make sense for some young people to focus more on like getting a practical education such as a trade school first, kind of like what he mentioned in John Adams' letter, where he talked about how he studies war and politics so that, you know, his kids and his grandkids can study pursuits such as painting and other, you know, higher pursuits like that. So that's the first question: if some people should focus on practical education first. And then my second question is, how do we make a liberal education more widely available so that it's not you know, so difficult to attain? How do we make that more widely available for our society?
Okay, the answer to the first question is, of course, there are some people for whom just aren't ready for college, and to send them into college without being ready is doing them an immense disservice. Some people are not ready because they lack the tools. Some people are not ready because they lack the inclination. And I guess my parents went through a very different kind of secondary school system in sort of pre-World War II, well, pre and early post-World War II Europe. And neither of them was regarded as quote unquote college material. So they were taught how to, my dad and my mom both got business education. They were trained for office work. And in Europe, there still is a very strong apprentice program. And so I have no objection to creating that kind of apprentice program and having people who would be ill-served by being dropped in a highly academic setting, do something else. They can perhaps come back to it when they're older. I actually hired an alum to teach a class for us this semester. He's older than I am. He started his college career at the University of North Carolina, got married and dropped out, and came back to school in his 40s. He graduated from Oglethorpe, got a law degree, had a very successful legal career, just retired from practicing law. Now, he was, by successful, I do not mean vastly wealth generating. He was the head of the public defender's office in Athens, Clarke County. But here's a guy who, smart enough, but emotionally and for a lot of reasons wasn't ready for college when he first entered. But when he was ready, boy, was he ready. So there, I think a lot of different paths. And for some people, you may never get to college, but if you are in a job that generates wealth, maybe your kids or your grandchildren. Again, Neither of my parents is a college graduate. You know, I have 3 degrees. My sister has 2. And all of our kids have college degrees. So the seed was planted by that generation and it's borne fruit. I mean, you can question PhD in political science. Some kind of. My son, who also majored in political science, is fond of telling me how useless that is. And the same with his wife is getting a PhD in clinical, starting a PhD program in clinical neuroscience this fall. Neither of her parents is college grad, but the seed bore fruit in the next generation. So that was part of the answer. And then, how do you make liberal education or more widely available? Some of it starts in K through 12. I have a former student who is teaching in a humanities institute in a high school, a public high school in the Atlanta suburbs. So they're teaching humanities to high school students. It's all these schools, especially in fairly affluent places like Forsyth County, Georgia. You've got the STEM Institute, you've got the Performing Arts magnet. They have a humanities magnet. It attracts a particular kind of student, but it opens these things up to them before they go away to college. We homeschooled our kids, and one of the things my wife and I did when we were homeschooling, toward the end of our kids' homeschooling careers, the infrastructure for homeschooling was really developing in the Atlanta area. And so there were these programs where essentially teachers offered a la carte classes to homeschool students and parents and their kids. And my wife and I taught humanities to middle schoolers. So we read, we tried to make it at their level, but our 7th and 8th graders read Homer. They read Voltaire. They read a little Plato. They read a little romantic poetry. And some of them actually got really excited about it. Now, I will never my wife is a much better teacher of middle schoolers than I am, but I was along for the ride. I got pulled in when we were talking about stuff like Plato, and I tried to make it intelligent. But, I think the more you do earlier, the better. My son went for a couple of years to a very high status public elementary school. And they had 2 different kinds of sort of enrichment programs. One was junior grade books and the other was accelerated reader. And accelerated reader was basically read a lot and answer really stupid comprehension questions. Junior grade books was really an attempt to introduce students to age-appropriate great literature. And it was a much better program than accelerated reader from our point of view. But all the parents in our neighborhood want to do is check the box at disenrichment program. And accelerated reader was the easy one to do. With junior grade books, you actually had to have people who knew what they were doing. And my wife got trained, and the trainer said, you're pretty good at this. She just, I do it for a living. But, if you have someone who has a liberal education, he or she can share it with kids. So, where does it begin? It begins, K through 12. It begins at home. We discovered books on tape when we were traveling. We did a lot of driving. So my kids got through things like The Count of Monte Cristo on tape. it's a habit that actually is carried over. My son lives in Athens and works in Atlanta. It's an hour and a half commute each way every day. Moby Dick on tape. So you create habits that just continue, and you don't have to be professional. Just love it and continue doing it. Yes.
I have a question that relates to the previous question. In your opinion, could the difference between education out of necessity versus the education for scholarly interest kind of contribute to the issue of degree inflation, since many people go into college with that they feel the need to pursue one specific field, go into that, and then when they get out, they realize, oh shoot, what do I do now? Could that kind of like the issue of this kind of contribute to that?
I'm trying to understand your question. So you're asking initially about grade inflation, right?
Yes, sir.
I'll defer to the other professors. Grade inflation, if you're an easy grader, you're likely to get better student evaluation. So, and if you get better student evaluations, you're more likely to be tenured. I'm not saying that he gets by on his charm and good looks, and his substance. But I think one of the reasons for grade inflation is the fact that, well, I mean, I can tell you, the harsh, and it is the kind of, academic capitalism. I get tenured and promoted because I have lots of bottoms in the seats I teach, and because those bottoms in the seats give me good evaluations. Now, I'll ask the students, you're not going to answer this honestly. Studies show that professors who give better grades or higher grades get better evaluation. So two professors doing exactly the same thing, you couldn't do this as an experiment, but if that's right, then I could do everything else the same, but if I give, one standard deviation lower grades, my evaluations are going to be worse. If I don't flatter the students, my evaluations are going to be worse. If I don't entertain the students, my evaluations are going to be worse. And also, for all those reasons, if I'm a hard grader, I'm not entertaining and so on, not as many bottoms in seats. That affects me, maybe. It also affects my department, because how do we get new lines, professors? Bottoms in seats, right? Or faces on the screen, whatever. So there are people who will offer even more sinister explanations than that, but I think a lot of it just has to do with the way in which everyone now is evaluated in large measure thanks to course evaluations, and then departments are evaluated by how many students they have, and so you don't want your boring professors like me teaching your first year students, because then you're not gonna have many second and third years. So you gotta have the young, sexy ones.
We have one final question from
Yes.
my audience. John asked, in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton refers to the new American Republic to be as a commercial republic. How does this square, or does this square, with the message in Adams' letter that you discussed?
Well, I think Adams acknowledges that commerce generates the wealth that makes it possible for some to pursue the aesthetic experience. So in some sense, Adams would say, yeah, we need all this stuff. We need commerce, we need agriculture, we need naval architecture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And by philosophy, he didn't mean philosophy, he meant science and mathematics. We need STEM, we need commerce, we need A&M, so that we generate wealth, so that some people can appreciate voluntarily. We're not making them do it. Great art. The other reason, they wanted a commercial republic was because they saw that the ancient republics, which were not commercial republics, were always driven by factious conflict. And the nice thing about commerce is that it's, in some sense, it multiplies the different kinds of interests in a society, and that's a good thing because then there's kind of no natural or obvious majority. And the other thing about commercial interests is that you can compromise. So I want $100 million for my project. You want $100 million for your project. We could be, mortal enemies, or we could each take half a lot and live peacefully. The good thing from the point of view of political peace and stability about commercial republicanism is that it actually facilitates and requires a kind of social peace. Can you compromise on identity? Would you want to compromise on identity? So there you get, there are no win-win propositions in identity. There's, I win, you lose. I win and I just stomp you into the ground. And it's, only natural that people who get stomped into the ground fight back and that they adopt the same non-compromising tropes that their adversaries use. When Donald Trump was running in 2016, I told my students that he was practicing white identity politics. And in some measures, in some respects, he was. And, it's unsavory. It produces conflict. I'd rather it just be about money. I'd much rather it be about the good, the true, and the beautiful. But if we've got money, then there's room for me to talk about that. If it's all about identity, then, oh gosh. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. We take out the hot seat now. Question, you actually cut out of your lecture. This was our last lecture of this academic year. We hope to continue this again in the fall, starting with Constitution Day. So we hope to see you again. Stay in touch with us by searching us on Facebook, Tocqueville Lecture Series. We'll see updates there. If you want to watch this one or any of our past lectures, you can look at our YouTube channel, Tocqueville Lecture Series on YouTube, or you can see our past lectures and watch this one again. Thank you to Dr. Knippenberg for this outstanding presentation. We hope you have a wonderful night, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the future. Take care of yourselves.